Blue Book: The German Ideology, 1845 to 1846, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In the middle of the 19th century, two young thinkers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, sat in the smoky rooms of Brussels and later London, surrounded by scraps of notes, half-finished manuscripts, and restless ideas that would change the world forever. The world they lived in was trembling. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped cities, torn apart old social structures, and given rise to a new working class, the proletariat. Amid this upheaval, Marx and Engels asked a radical question: what truly drives history, ideas or material life? In the German Ideology, 1845 to 1846, Marx and Engels launched their first systematic critique of previous philosophy, especially German idealism, which claimed that human ideas and consciousness shaped the world. Marx and Engels turned this on its head. They declared that life determines consciousness, not the other way around. In other words, our material conditions, how we produce food, build houses, organize labor, create the very ideas, morals, and beliefs we live by. But their work was not just philosophical, it was revolutionary. Written in exile, unpublished during Marx's lifetime, the German Ideology was like a blueprint for understanding society, a map to decode history. Within its pages, Marx introduced historical materialism, the idea that all of human history is a struggle between classes, driven by economic production and material needs. This book is more than a critique, it's the moment Marx and Engels found their voice. It's the bridge between philosophy and revolution, between thought and action. To truly understand modern social theory, politics, and even economics, we must start here in these early, thunderous ideas written by two men who saw the future emerging from the machinery of their time. Let's explore the German ideology in 3 powerful chapters, each uncovering a layer of how Marx and Engels redefined our understanding of humanity and history. Chapter 1: The World Before Marx, Breaking the Chains of Idealism. Before Karl Marx ever picked up a pen to write the German ideology, philosophy had already traveled a long road, one paved by giants like Kant, Fichte, and most importantly, Hegel. Their world was one where ideas ruled reality, where the mind was seen as the creator of the material world. Hegel had built an enormous, almost cathedral-like system of thought, a grand vision where spirit, or Geist, evolved through history, expressing itself through nations, religions, and art, until reaching full self-awareness. It was beautiful, elegant and, to Marx, deeply flawed. Marx began his intellectual life as a young Hegelian, part of a circle of radical thinkers who admired Hegel but also tried to push his ideas toward political and social reform. These included figures like Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, and others who were trying to reconcile philosophy with the human condition of their time. They debated freedom, religion, morality, but always from the standpoint of ideas. They believed that if people only thought differently, society would change. To them, the problem of the world was false consciousness, wrong ideas, misguided beliefs. The cure was philosophy. The thinker was the doctor of the age. But Marx would soon come to see this as a dead end. He realized that if you start from ideas alone, you remain trapped inside your own head. You can explain everything except reality itself. He began to ask a dangerous question. What if it's not our ideas that shape our lives, but our lives that shape our ideas? That question, simple but explosive, would become the foundation of historical materialism. But before Marx could build it, he had to tear down the old house of philosophy brick by brick. The German philosophical landscape. To understand what Marx and Engels were rebelling against, we need to imagine the intellectual Germany of the 1840s. It was a place bursting with abstract debates about human essence, freedom, and God, yet astonishingly disconnected from the everyday misery of workers in factories and farmers in fields. Philosophers spoke of the evolution of spirit while peasants starved. The most dominant influence was Hegel, who saw history as the unfolding of a divine rational plan. Every event, revolutions, wars, reforms, was, to him, a necessary stage in the self-realization of spirit. The Prussian state itself, with its bureaucracy and monarchy, was viewed as the embodiment of reason. Many accepted this as near sacred truth. Then came the young Hegelians, a rebellious younger generation who tried to extract the radical potential of Hegel's ideas. They turned his system upside down. If history is spirit coming to know itself, then maybe human beings, not divine logic, are the true subjects of history. They argued that religion, especially Christianity, had alienated man from himself. Feuerbach, for instance, declared that God was just a projection of human qualities. By reclaiming those qualities, humanity could free itself. It was a bold step. But Marx saw that even Feuerbach, whom he admired, remained trapped within idealism. Feuerbach had replaced God with man, but he still treated man as an abstract essence, as if humanity were a single, timeless being, rather than billions of individuals living under very different social and economic conditions. In other words, philosophy kept talking about man, but ignored men and women. It spoke of freedom, but not of workers who had no bread. It imagined progress, but failed to look at who actually benefited from it. Marx, always restless, found this intolerable. He wanted to ground philosophy in the real, in material life, in what people actually do every day, how they work, how they produce, how they survive. The philosophers have only interpreted the world, he would later write. The point, however, is to change it. From philosophy to life. Marx's break with the young Hegelians didn't happen overnight. It came through experience, through seeing the living contradictions of modern Europe. By the mid-1840s, capitalism was transforming the continent. Factories roared, cities swelled, railways stretched across nations. A new working class was being born, one that had nothing but its labor to sell. Marx, living in Paris, Brussels, and London during these years, witnessed firsthand how industrial progress came with human suffering. Children worked 14-hour days. Families crowded into airless rooms. Wages barely covered food. The working class was not just poor, it was alienated, cut off from the product of its labor, from its own humanity. To Marx, these were not moral accidents, they were the direct outcome of the economic structure of society. The more he studied, the more he saw a pattern. The mode of production, how goods are made and distributed, shaped every other part of life: politics, religion, family, law, even philosophy. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels declared, "The first premise of all human existence is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature." That sounds almost obvious today, but in the 1840s it was revolutionary. It meant that before we talk about consciousness, ideas, or morals, we must talk about how people live, how they get food, shelter, and security. It was a shift from heaven to earth, from abstract spirit to tangible matter. For Marx, production was not just an economic activity, it was the foundation of all human history. How we produce, whether by hand, by machine, as slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, determines how we relate to one another. Those relations form the structure of society. Change the mode of production, and you change the whole social order. This was the beginning of historical materialism, Marx's great contribution to human thought. But in the German ideology, it appears not as a final theory but as a discovery in motion, a breakthrough happening on the page. A collaborative revolution. It's impossible to tell the story of the German ideology without Friedrich Engels. Engels, the son of a German industrialist, had lived in Manchester, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. There he saw the dark side of progress, the exploitation, the disease, the squalor, and wrote about it in his book The Condition of the Working Class in England. When Marx read it, he knew he had found an intellectual ally and, more than that, a lifelong friend. Together in Brussels between 1845 and 1846, they began to put their ideas into a manuscript. They wrote feverishly pages upon pages, mocking the young Hegelians, dissecting philosophy, and constructing a new materialist view of history. Their energy was immense. They worked side by side, arguing, laughing, rewriting. Engels later said that their ideas were born in endless conversations that stretched deep into the night. The result was the German ideology, a sprawling, unfinished work that the authors themselves joked might be a settlement with our former philosophical conscience. Indeed, it was a clean break from their past selves. It marked the moment Marx and Engels turned from speculative philosophy towards scientific socialism. Ironically, the book was never published in their lifetimes. Publishers found it too long, too strange, too polemical. The manuscript was shelved, literally left in a box, and only rediscovered decades later. Yet within those dusty pages lay the seeds of every major Marxist idea that would later shake the world. The critique of German idealism. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels launch a ferocious attack on the young Hegelians, especially Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, and Feuerbach. They accuse them of being prisoners of pure thought, unable to see that ideas arise from material life. They wrote, "Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process." This was the pivot. To understand consciousness, you must understand life process, how people live and work together. To understand morality, you must look at the conditions of production. To understand religion, you must see the social needs that create it. Marx and Engels mocked philosophers who thought they could change society through ideas alone. They have not yet begun to understand, Marx sneered, that the holy family of ideas is but the reflection of the real family, and that the real family is shaped by the material means of life. What they proposed instead was breathtakingly simple and yet world-altering. The material basis of life determines the ideological superstructure. The economy, the class structure, the relations of production, these are the roots. Politics, law, culture, religion, these are the branches and leaves. The former shapes the latter, not the other way around. This view shattered centuries of philosophical tradition. No longer was history the story of great thinkers or divine plans, it was the story of real people producing their means of life, struggling against material limits, and transforming society in the process. History as a material process. For Marx and Engels, history is not a collection of random events or moral lessons, it's a material process driven by the development of production. As humans learn new ways to make and distribute goods, their social relations change. When the old ways of organizing production become too restrictive, society enters into crisis, leading to revolutionary transformation. They summarized this idea elegantly. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Though that line would later become famous in the Communist Manifesto, its roots are already visible in the German ideology. Here Marx and Engels describe how each mode of production, primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, contains internal contradictions that push history forward. Under capitalism, the contradiction lies between those who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and those who sell their labor, the proletariat. The tension between these classes would eventually erupt in revolution not as a moral necessity, but as a historical inevitability once material conditions mature. This was the most radical claim of all, that history has a logic, not a divine one, but a human and material one. It is driven not by God or reason, but by the struggle of people to live, produce, and survive under changing conditions. Breaking the chains of idealism. By the end of the German ideology, Marx and Engels had effectively declared war on all philosophy that floated above reality. They mocked the idea that social change could come from pure thought. Instead, they offered a framework grounded in praxis, the unity of theory and practice. To know the world, you must engage with it. To change it, you must understand the material forces that shape it. This fusion of analysis and action became the heartbeat of Marxism. Their rejection of idealism was not just intellectual, it was moral and political. It meant taking the side of the real, of the working class, of human beings living under the pressure of necessity. It meant rejecting illusions and facing the material truth of society, however uncomfortable it might be. Marx and Engels had broken the chains of German philosophy not to escape thought, but to liberate thought from abstraction. In doing so, they gave philosophy a new task, to serve humanity by understanding the material foundations of its existence. A new beginning. And so, by 1846, the young Marx and Engels had crossed a threshold. The German ideology was the burial ground of their old selves and the birthplace of a new worldview. They had left behind the speculative clouds of idealism and stepped onto the solid ground of history, labor, and production. The old philosophers looked at the stars and saw the reflection of spirit. Marx and Engels looked at the factory floor and saw the engine of history. They were no longer just thinkers, they were builders of a new science, a science of society itself. The world before Marx was a world of abstract ideas floating above human life. The world after the German ideology would never be the same. Philosophy had been turned right side up. In the next chapter, we'll enter the heart of that revolution, the birth of historical materialism itself, how life creates thought, how production creates consciousness, and how the story of humanity can only be understood through the way we make our living on this earth. Chapter 2, The Discovery of Historical Materialism. Life creates thought. When Karl Marx wrote that life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life, he was not merely making a philosophical observation, he was rewriting the rules of how we understand humanity itself. This was the intellectual earthquake at the heart of the German ideology. It was here, in the middle of the 1840s, that Marx and Engels discovered what they later called historical materialism, the idea that to understand history, you must begin not with ideas, but with the way people live and work. It sounds simple now, almost obvious. But in their time, this was nothing less than a revolution in thought. Because for centuries, thinkers had believed that ideas rule the world, that great men, great religions, and great philosophies were the forces that shaped civilization. Marx and Engels looked at the world around them, the factories, the cities, the suffering, the wealth, and said, no. It's not consciousness that creates life, it's life that creates consciousness. Let's unfold this discovery step by step, as Marx and Engels did, moving from daily life, to labor, to society, and finally to history itself. 1. Beginning from the ground, life before thought. In the German ideology, Marx begins not with philosophy, but with biology. Before we can talk about ideas, religion, art, or politics, he says, we must talk about how people survive. Humans are living beings, part of nature. To live, they must eat, drink, and find shelter. To do that, they must work, they must act upon nature, transform it, and shape it for their needs. This activity, labor, is the foundation of all human existence. Marx wrote, "The first historical act is thus the production of means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. That's where history begins, not in the heavens, not in the mind, but on the ground, in the struggle for survival. The first human society wasn't built around ideas or moral codes, it was built around food, shelter, and the tools to obtain them. And here's the crucial twist: once humans begin producing their means of life, they also begin producing their social relations. How people organize labor, whether in tribes, families, or classes, determines how they relate to one another. So from the very beginning, production and social relations are intertwined. Together, they form what Marx calls the mode of production, the material structure on which the rest of society is built. Every time this mode of production changes, say, from hunting and gathering to agriculture, or from feudal farming to industrial capitalism, the entire social structure shifts with it. And that, Marx says, is how history moves. Not through divine will, not through ideas, but through the development of the material forces of life. 2. The web of production and cooperation. To understand how life creates thought, we must look at how humans produce together. Unlike animals, humans engage in cooperative labor. A beaver builds its dam, a bee makes honey, but humans build cities, ships, and entire civilizations. This cooperation requires communication, coordination, and shared purpose. Over time, it gives rise to language, culture, and eventually ideas. In other words, our ability to think, to imagine, to plan, to philosophize is rooted in the social nature of production. Our consciousness is not born in isolation, it emerges through the collective effort to survive. Marx and Engels make a subtle but profound point. Language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical consciousness that exists also for other men. Think about that for a moment. Before there was philosophy, there was speech. Before speech, there was cooperation. And before cooperation, there was labor, the act of shaping the world together. This chain, labor rightward arrow, cooperation rightward arrow, language rightward arrow, thought, is the backbone of historical materialism. It shows that human consciousness is a social product. The ideas in our heads are not floating in the ether, they are reflections of our real interactions in the world. Even the loftiest concepts, justice, freedom, love, art, arise out of this material soil. When material life changes, so do our ideas. 3. From need to ideology. Once the basic needs of survival are met, new needs emerge for beauty, for comfort, for recognition. Marx notes that every new mode of production creates not only new goods but also new desires, new ways of thinking. This is where ideology comes in, the system of beliefs, values, and assumptions that reflect and justify a particular mode of life. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels argue that every ruling class creates an ideology to defend its own power. The ideas that dominate a society are the ideas of the ruling class, because they control the material means of life and, just as importantly, the means of thought, the schools, the media, the churches, the cultural institutions. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. So under feudalism, religion and divine right justified the power of kings and nobles. Under capitalism, individualism and private property serve the same function for the bourgeoisie. In each case, ideology presents itself as eternal truth, but in reality, it's a reflection of the material relations of its time. When the economic base changes, the ideological superstructure begins to tremble. Old beliefs lose their hold, and new ones rise to replace them. This dynamic, the tension between the base, material production, and the superstructure, ideas and institutions, became one of Marx's most enduring concepts. But in the German ideology, it's not yet a rigid formula. It's alive, fluid, full of discovery. Marx and Engels are feeling their way toward a new science of history, one that sees thought as a reflection of life, and life as a process of production. For the mirror of society. Imagine, Marx suggests, that human consciousness is like a mirror. But this mirror doesn't hang in the air, it's attached to the workshop, the factory, the field. It reflects the world as we live it, not as we dream it. When workers labor under machines, their ideas about time, discipline, and value change. When society moves from agriculture to industry, the entire texture of life shifts: family roles, gender expectations, even religion. That's why Marx says that life determines consciousness. Not in a mechanical or one-dimensional way, but through the deep interconnection between how we live and how we think. Our morality, for example, often mirrors our economic life. A society that runs on competition praises ambition and self-reliance. A society that depends on cooperation values solidarity. Even our sense of right and wrong grows out of the way we organize survival. This insight was not meant to reduce human thought to economics, but to reveal the material roots of meaning. It was a way of reconnecting the mind with the body, theory with practice, spirit with life. 5. The division of labor and the birth of classes. One of Marx's great discoveries in the German ideology is the concept of division of labor. As societies grow, work becomes specialized. Some produce food, others make tools, others manage trade. At first, this division increases efficiency, but soon, it creates inequality. Those who control the tools and resources begin to dominate those who only have their labor. Out of this process emerges the class structure. Marx writes that as soon as the division of labor appears, each man has a particular, exclusive sphere of activity. That exclusivity, that separation, leads to alienation. People no longer see their work as an expression of their life, but as a duty, a necessity. In primitive societies, production and life were one. The hunter, the farmer, the craftsman, they could see the direct fruits of their labor. But in class societies, that unity breaks. The worker becomes separated from the product, from the process, from others, and from themselves. This alienation is not just economic, it's psychological and spiritual. The way we produce shapes not only our bodies but also our minds. The more hierarchical and exploitative production becomes, the more distorted human consciousness becomes. And this, Marx says, is why ideology exists, to make this distortion seem natural. Religion, philosophy, and culture teach people to accept inequality as destiny, rather than as the product of human relations. By exposing this, Marx and Engels were not attacking religion or morality as such, they were revealing the material forces behind them. They were saying, these are not eternal truths. These are reflections of how society is organized. 6. The material history of humanity. At this point, the German ideology expands from social analysis to world history. Marx and Engels trace how different modes of production, tribal, ancient, feudal, capitalist, each create their own material and ideological worlds. In tribal society, property is communal, survival depends on shared labor. In ancient society, slavery divides classes. In feudal society, land ownership defines power. Under capitalism, everything including labor itself becomes a commodity. Each stage contains its own contradictions, its own seeds of transformation. As productive forces evolve, old structures can no longer contain them. The tension between the forces of production, what we can do, and the relations of production, how we're organized to do it, drives history forward. This is not destiny, it's motion, the motion of real people struggling within real conditions. In that motion, Marx saw the future. Capitalism, like feudalism before it, would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, giving birth to a new social order, a society without private property or class domination. 7. A new way of seeing the world. Historical materialism was not just a theory for Marx and Engels, it was a method, a new way of seeing everything. It taught that to understand art, you must look at the society that produced it. To understand politics, you must look at the class interests behind it. To understand philosophy itself, you must look at the material conditions of the philosophers. It was a reversal of traditional thinking. Where Hegel saw history as the unfolding of spirit, Marx saw it as the unfolding of labor. Where idealists saw progress in the development of ideas, Marx saw it in the development of productive power. But perhaps the most radical aspect of this method was its hopefulness. If society is made by human labor, then it can be remade by human labor. If history is driven by material conditions, then by changing those conditions, by changing production and property, we can change history itself. In this sense, the German ideology was not just a critique, it was an invitation. It invited readers to stop dreaming about a better world and start understanding the one they live in, because only through that understanding could real change begin. 8. Life creates thought, the final lesson. By the time Marx and Engels finished the German ideology, they had drawn one of the most profound conclusions in modern thought, that being determines consciousness. This didn't mean that ideas don't matter, it meant that ideas have roots. Every philosophy, every religion, every law arises out of the soil of material life. When the soil changes, when technology, labor, and class relations evolve, the plants of ideology change with it. This insight connected the dots between economics, politics, and culture in a way no one had done before. It made history a human process, not a divine mystery. It gave the oppressed a map of their own world, a way to see that their suffering was not natural, but historical, and therefore, changeable. That was the birth of scientific socialism, not a utopian dream, but a theory grounded in the material conditions of life. 9. The legacy of a hidden manuscript. Ironically, the German ideology remained unpublished during Marx's lifetime. Its pages gathered dust for nearly a century, only later recognized as the foundation of Marxist thought. Yet the ideas it contained shaped everything that followed: the Communist Manifesto, Capital, and the global movements that would claim Marx's name. More importantly, it changed how we think about ourselves. It taught us that to understand any society, we must look beneath its stories to the way it produces and reproduces life. Marx and Engels had shown that thought is not a gift from heaven, it's a product of labor. Human beings make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. They inherit a world shaped by material forces, and by changing those forces, they change themselves. That, in a sentence, is the heart of historical materialism. Life creates thought, and by changing life, we transform thought itself. Closing reflection. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels didn't simply write about philosophy, they buried the old kind of philosophy and gave birth to a new science of history. They showed that behind every idea stands a workshop, a field, a factory, and behind every dream of freedom lies the struggle to master material life. It was a theory born not in libraries but in the streets, the mills, and the crowded tenements of the industrial age. It turned the world upside down, or perhaps, for the first time, right side up. And as we turn to the next chapter, We'll see how this new worldview born from the soil of history would lead Marx and Engels to their most explosive insight yet, the class struggle as the driving force of all social change, and the vision of human liberation that would echo across the next 2 centuries. Chapter 3, The Birth of Historical Materialism: How Marx and Engels Changed the Map of Human Thought. Imagine the world as a great stage filled with kings and peasants, merchants and slaves, philosophers and revolutionaries all playing their roles in the drama of history. Most philosophers before Marx looked at this stage and saw it as a mirror of ideas. They believed that the script of history was written by human consciousness, by religion, morality, and the spirit of the age. But in the German ideology, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels walked onto the stage with a new lens. They turned the camera around from the heavens of ideas to the muddy ground beneath human feet. For Marx and Engels, it was not ideas that shaped the world, but the world, its material conditions, its economic systems, its division of labor that shaped ideas. This reversal was radical, almost shocking for their time. They called it historical materialism, and it would become one of the most transformative theories in modern thought. This chapter explores how Marx and Engels built this vision, how they dismantled the old idealist ways of thinking, constructed a materialist understanding of history, and in doing so, laid the foundations for what we now call Marxism. The world they inherited. To appreciate their revolution in thought, we must first understand the world they were reacting to. In mid-19th century Europe, philosophy was still dominated by Hegelian idealism. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of Germany's greatest philosophers, had described history as the unfolding of the world spirit. For Hegel, material events, wars, economies, technologies were merely expressions of the deeper evolution of consciousness. In other words, the world changed because ideas changed. When people's awareness advanced, so did their societies. This was the intellectual air that young Marx and Engels breathed. But as they grew older and saw the grim realities of industrial capitalism, child labor, poverty, hunger in the midst of wealth, they began to doubt this elegant picture. How could ideas alone explain why the poor lived in filth while factory owners grew rich? How could spirit account for the misery of the working class? Marx began to see that something far more concrete was driving history, the way human beings produced their means of survival. From Hegel to history, turning philosophy upside down. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels famously declared that they were turning Hegel right side up. Hegel had imagined that consciousness determines life. Marx and Engels replied, "Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life." This one sentence contains an entire worldview. It means that before people can think, dream, or philosophize, they must first eat, drink, build shelter, and survive. These basic acts, production and reproduction, form the foundation of all social life. Thus, the true starting point of history is not the realm of ideas but the real, material conditions under which people live. Once we understand how a society produces what it needs, its food, tools, and goods, we can understand everything else, its laws, its religion, its culture, even its art. For example, in a society where land is privately owned and worked by peasants, religion may emphasize obedience and faith. But in a capitalist society built on factories and wage labor, new ideas emerge about freedom, individuality, and progress. The material base changes, and with it, the whole structure of thought. This was Marx's great insight: every society has a material base, its economic structure, and an ideological superstructure, its laws, morals, and ideas. The base shapes the superstructure, not the other way around. The division of labor from cooperation to class. Marx and Engels took their analysis even deeper by studying how the division of labor, the way tasks are distributed in society, affects human relationships. In primitive societies, people worked together collectively. There was no sharp distinction between rich and poor, everyone contributed to survival. But as tools improved and production increased, some people began to control more resources than others. This led to private property and with it, inequality. Over time, societies split into classes, rulers and ruled, owners and workers, masters and slaves. The division of labor became not just an economic fact but a social and moral order. People's roles in production determined their entire way of life, their power, their worldview, even their sense of self. This was revolutionary because it explains social hierarchies not as natural or divine but as products of history. Feudal lords, kings, merchants, and capitalists were not born to rule, they emerged from specific material conditions. Change those conditions, Marx argued, and you change society itself. Ideology, the mirror that lies. One of the most fascinating parts of the German ideology is Marx and Engels' analysis of how ideas function in society. They argued that the ruling class not only controls material production, factories, land, money, but also the production of ideas. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. This means that those in power shape how people think about the world. They control the schools, the media, the churches, and the legal systems, all the institutions that define what seems normal or natural. For example, capitalism promotes the idea that competition and profit are human nature, that hard work always leads to success, and that poverty is the fault of the poor. These ideas justify the system by making inequality appear inevitable. In this sense, ideology is like a mirror that distorts reality. It makes people believe that the world is just as it should be, even when it serves only a few. Marx and Engels sought to break that illusion. They wanted to show that ideology was not truth but a reflection of material interests, a tool of power disguised as common sense. History as a process of struggle. In the traditional view, history was a story of great men, kings, warriors, inventors, thinkers. Marx and Engels replaced that narrative with something far more dynamic, a history driven by class struggle. From ancient slavery to feudalism to capitalism, every stage of society has been marked by conflict between those who own the means of production and those who do not. History, they wrote, is nothing but the succession of distinct generations, each exploiting the materials, capital, and productive forces handed down to it by all preceding ones. In this view, history is not random. It moves through stages as productive forces develop and old systems become too restrictive to contain them. When that happens, when the material base outgrows the existing order, revolutions occur. Thus, feudalism gave way to capitalism because the old agrarian world could not sustain the industrial age. And capitalism, in turn, will give way to socialism when its contradictions such as inequality, alienation, and crises become unbearable. This process is not driven by morality or ideals but by material necessity. The laws of history are economic and social, not metaphysical. The end of prehistory. One of the most poetic ideas in the German ideology is Marx and Engels' notion that humanity has so far lived only in prehistory. True history, they said, will begin only when people collectively control their means of production, when class divisions disappear, and humans are no longer ruled by material necessity. In such a society, people will work not out of survival but out of creative fulfillment. Labor will become an expression of freedom, not exploitation. This vision is not merely economic, it is profoundly humanistic. It imagines a world where material abundance allows spiritual and intellectual flourishing, where we are no longer alienated from our own labor, from nature, or from one another. It is this dream that makes the German ideology more than a critique. It is a manifesto of hope, legacy and modern relevance. Though unpublished during Marx's lifetime, the German ideology became foundational for later Marxist thought. It provided the theoretical skeleton for works like Das Kapital and inspired generations of thinkers from Lenin and Gramsci to Sartre and Althusser. But beyond political movements, its insights continue to resonate in modern sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies. The idea that social conditions shape consciousness has influenced everything from media theory to psychology. Even in today's digital capitalism, where our identities are shaped by algorithms, consumer habits, and data, the ghost of the German ideology walks among us. We still live in a world where material systems produce the illusions that define our consciousness. Marx and Engels' challenge remains, to unmask those illusions, to see the material world as it is, and to imagine how it might be transformed. The story's end or beginning. In the final pages of the German ideology, Marx and Engels sounded almost amused at how philosophy had lost itself in abstractions. They declared that their goal was not to interpret the world but to change it. And perhaps that is the lasting power of their thought. It demands action. It insists that human beings are not spectators of history but its makers. By grounding history in the real conditions of life, Marx and Engels gave us a new lens to understand our world and to reshape it. The birth of historical materialism was not just a philosophical event, it was a declaration of human power, a call to step out of the shadows of ideology and into the light of reality. So, when we read the German ideology today, we are not merely studying an old book, we are standing at the doorway of a new consciousness, one that sees history not as fate, but as something we create with our own hands.